Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Women in Literature. And today we are putting some closure onto Frankenstein. As you can see in the notes that I've posted above, I've got things set up for our extra credit chat room and also for our extra credit Zoom. What we will be doing on Tuesdays from 12 to 12:30 is having an extra credit class discussion via our chat room, and you can find that at the top of our Moodle page. There should be a separate section there that's listed as live chat room. And then we'll be doing the same thing via Zoom on Thursdays from 12 to 12:30. I will be listing the Zoom address in the next day or so to that particular folder so that you can access that if you wanted to. Again, it's extra credit, but it is an opportunity for you to interact with me and with your peers if you so desired. Also, in terms of the journals, I had made an error in terms of due dates. So because that was my error, you've got up until the 11th to hand in your journal for Frankenstein, though I'm hopeful that you would be able to hand in your journal prior to that. Please send me your journal via PDF, via email. And in terms of the papers, I am hopeful that next class I can begin to talk a little bit more about paper topics and the construction of writing a paper. As you are hopefully at this point in the semester done with Frankenstein and you're in the midst of reading Persuasion. If you're in the midst of reading Persuasion, you've probably noticed this novel moves very slowly. This is very deliberate from the author to make a commentary on the lifestyles of the characters that she's examining. These are individuals who come from a good amount of wealth and privilege. So there's definitely a commentary, a negative one, about class in that text, as well as a commentary about gender. That said, certainly Frankenstein also examines wealth and privilege, and it's one of the ways that Mary Shelley's novel can be interpreted. As you know, last class we talked about how the novel can be read in a lot of different kinds of ways, and that the epistolary approach to writing this novel leads to a certain level of ambiguity in relation to the reliability of the narrator, which is a common element that oftentimes is found in Gothic literature, and ambiguous endings so that a reader who doesn't necessarily want to accept a supernatural or a occult explanation could perhaps find another explanation. But this novel also straddles science fiction, and there are lots of medical questions in there about the consequences of seeking knowledge, and is there some sort of moral and ethical responsibility to not seek knowledge that could be beyond the realm of mankind. And I think I mentioned that there are lots of modern day parallels now with issues such as cloning. And then finally, the way that we're reading this novel, in addition to all of the other ways that this novel can be read, is talking about gender. And that Mary Shelley very deliberately gave us a male centric world where there is little agency for female, and I think that's definitely a commentary on the idea of her society. Then when a society excludes female, then terrible things happen, and definitely terrible things happen in this particular text. Victor tries to play both mother and father. He tries to create life, which is the domain of only God, and also is the domain of female. And basically, he usurps the natural world to do that, and negative consequences result. And as you can see from the notes that I've posted above, that what I've done is I've dissected some important places in the novel that you may want to consider in terms of your thoughts and reflections about Frankenstein. The first being the very first letter that's addressed to Mrs. Seville, and that happens to be Walton's sister, Margaret. And while he does call her Margaret in letters as they proceed, the first reference to her as Mrs. Seville reminds me very much of Mrs. Mallard in The Story of an Hour, and how female is given identity based on her status of marriage and on her husband. In the first letter, Walton also says, and this is a quote, "I prefer glory to every enticement that wealth placed in my path." And this is something that also Victor experiences. There are a good number of parallels between Walton and Victor. They both come from fairly privileged backgrounds. They both decide to seek the unknowable. They both isolate themselves in order to do so. They both isolate themselves from the major females in their life, and negative consequences result. And I think I might have mentioned last class that if there's a happy ending in this novel, and that is questionable, it would be that perhaps Walton makes the ultimate decision to turn around and to learn from Victor's tale about the horrors of extreme arrogance and hubris. In the second letter, Walton talks about how he has no friend. And this is something that Victor also will discuss as he continues to isolate himself. Isolation is always a bad thing in the Gothic. Definitely, that's one of the major horrors of this text, is being alone and not having family, as the creature will be experiencing. And Walton talks about how he's going to be exploring unvisited regions to his sister. That's literal and figurative, as we begin to talk about Victor Frankenstein and how he too is exploring the unvisited regions of life and death. In the third letter, Walton says to his sister, "What can stop the determined heart and resolved will of man?" Again, very Victor-like, the idea that ultimately man has supreme control. And there definitely is a Christian element in this text, and that ultimately God is responsible for man, and that man cannot usurp God's role. In letter 4 to Walton, he talks or in letter 4 from Walton to his sister, he talks about how he meets Victor. What he says is very telling, and that he says that Victor was not, as other travelers seem to be, a savage inhabitant of some undiscovered island, but a European. And there's definitely a Eurocentric bias in this text, as progressive as this text is about embracing difference and not necessarily being ruled by appearance, which is why the creature is rejected, because the creature has a different appearance, because the creature is seen as different from others. In other words, the creature is seen as other, in effect. And definitely we can use that kind of commentary or that kind of thinking for issues related to racism and classism and sexism. Mary Shelley was also a victim of her time, and this text is definitely very Christian-centric and definitely very Eurocentric. In letter 4, and this is Walton and Victor, Walton is saying, "I sought for the dominion I should acquire and transmit over the elemental foes of our race." And Victor's response is, "Unhappy man, do you share my madness?" The idea that this is going to be a moral tale in which basically Victor is going to try to convince Walton that Walton shouldn't pursue ambition. There are negative consequences as a result of that. And in letter 4, Walton talks about Victor, about how Victor was a slave to his passion. That's a theme we'll see throughout the novel, this idea of servitude and mastery, and about how passion can overwhelm intellect. So we continue on. When we finally get to the first chapter is when we get Victor's story. Again, we talked about the problem with that, as though it sounds as if Victor himself is speaking, but ultimately this is Walton transcribing what Victor had said. But this is where we've got Victor using the I, so it's very easy to forget that Walton is basically the frame of the novel, and the only person we ever hear from in the entire novel is Walton himself. And Victor in chapter 1 talks about his parents and how Victor was their plaything and their idol and something better to their child. There's a good amount of irony here. Victor talks a little bit about how he was loved and embraced by his parents. One would assume that he would be able to duplicate that with the creature because Victor has had that experience, and he doesn't do that. Also, the idea that a child is a plaything or an idol very much perhaps explains Victor's attitude towards the creature, and that this is a creature that Victor is creating for Victor's own benefit, not for the benefit of the life itself. Notice I'm using the term creature rather than monster. I think Hollywood has conditioned us to talk about the creature as the monster. The real monster in this novel is Victor himself, and basically humanity as a whole, as they treat each other terribly and they reject this particular creature. So I'm always careful not to call the creature a monster. Although the creature is capable of monstrous acts, I would say that the true monster is Victor himself. And then Victor talks a little bit about how he met his sister. And this was someone who was motherless. And this is a theme we will be seeing over the course of the semester, characters without mothers. And Victor talks about that this child that was adopted by the family, Elizabeth, was very thin and very fair. And that's one of the reasons why they adopt her, because she isn't like the other children who seem very non-European. Again, you can see that Eurocentric bias with Shelley. This girl has blonde hair and blue eyes and is supposed to be the representation of what humans consider to be beautiful. And what Victor says, a little bit of foreshadowing about Elizabeth, and that till death she was to be mine only. And I know that this raises sometimes some eyebrows for individuals who are reading the text when they learn that this person who was raised as Victor's sister is also meant to be his mate. And when we read Persuasion, we'll see that it's not necessarily that unusual for cousins to marry. And one of the reasons why was about retaining bloodlines. And even in some states today, and I believe in the South, it's legal to marry a first cousin. But here, I know that seems somewhat incestuous, but we're not supposed to get that feeling when we're reading about the union that Victor's parents are hoping for between Victor and Elizabeth. The idea of arranged marriages, quite common at the time, which we will see in Persuasion. And we learn a little bit about William's murder ultimately. And what we find out is initially that Victor in chapter 2 found that the world was a secret that he desired to divine. It was the secrets of heaven and earth that he desired. Again, very Walton-like. He'll be punished for this kind of ambition. And in chapter 4, Victor says that I shunned my fellow creatures. So now we see how Victor's isolating himself and the negative consequences that result of that. In fact, this novel has also been read as a negative commentary on the patriarch work ethic, that isolating yourself for work and ambition at the exclusion of family and friends and nature and the natural world can only lead to negative consequences. But at any rate, Victor says in chapter 4 that he shunned his fellow creatures as if he had been guilty of a crime. And I've noticed that throughout the novel, Victor's vacillation, where he often talks about that he's guilty, but he's not really guilty. And I don't think he really accepts guilt, which is some of the things that I mentioned to some of you when you were posting about the epistolary novel in our forum, that while it's certainly true that we don't get a sense of guilt from the creator in the film, even in the novel, Victor's guilt is somewhat suspicious. It takes us up until chapter 5 to get to the creation scene, which is what's best known in Hollywood. That's where we get the dreary night in November, very gothic, where it's raining, and through electricity, which was a new discovery for the time, this creature is brought to life, and it's a huge monstrosity, and it's a very different physical appearance than what the 1931 film gives us. If you want to see a film that has perhaps a little bit more accuracy, I recommend the film that was done in the 1990s with Kenneth Branagh and Robert De Niro for Frankenstein. De Niro plays the creature. That said, of course, it's Hollywood, so they're going to take their liberties and so forth. But nevertheless, it does give us a more accurate portrayal of this creature. And then ultimately in chapter 6, Elizabeth is writing to Victor. And by this point, the creature has been created, and Victor has abandoned the creature in disgust because he's so horrified by its appearance, and the creature has run off. And at this point, Elizabeth is writing to Victor and says to him, Justine, you may remember, was a great favorite of yours. And this is kind of an artificial way to introduce another character. This character of Justine, who is part of Victor's family, who is ultimately framed for Victor's brother's murder, William's murder. And This is where I think Shelley makes perhaps some errors in terms of her writing, though I always feel somewhat uncomfortable criticizing someone in their late teens who was able to create a masterpiece like Frankenstein that has never been out of print. But the idea of introducing a character by saying to Victor, you might remember, Victor, that Justine was a great favorite of yours. Well, she's a great favorite of his. Obviously, he remembers. Perhaps more eyebrow raising is when the creature, after it runs off, happens to find a satchel of books in the woods and is able to teach itself to read. How's that for a suspension of disbelief? That said, there are some places that perhaps Shelley could have improved her novel, but they're few and far between. And then what we find out about Justine after the creature has killed William, this is when we learn about the creature story, and the creature has been continually rejected by humanity. So when the creature learns that William is related to Victor, the creature's first response is to kill William as an act of justice and vengeance. But Justine confesses to the crime even though she's innocent. And she says, I did confess, but I confessed a lie. I confessed that I might obtain absolution. And this reminds me very much of the cult of true womanhood and the importance of piety for female during this time period. So much so that when Justine is threatened by church officials with hellfire, she confesses to something that she never committed. Just to give you an idea of the importance of piety for female in this time. In chapter 9, we learn more about this creature. Its incredibly articulate nature, and that gets us into the question of nature versus nurture. And that is a debate that we've had in sociology and psychology, and we still have today, that how is an individual formed? Are they basically born through genetics to have certain personality traits? Or are those personality traits determined by environment? Or is there some combination of the two, which is usually the explanation that's given? We can't say that this creature was born bad. If anything else, this creature was much like a tabula rasa, if you've ever heard that before, a blank slate. Philosophers have discussed that idea of being born as a blank slate and basically having environment shape you. If nothing else, perhaps the creature is born not just as a blank slate, but slightly benevolent, because it immediately appreciates nature, and that's seen as a positive always in the romantic period. It engages in benevolent activities when it meets the DeLacy family and it learns that the family is struggling. It takes action to help the family with food and with chores. The creature teaches itself language, which again, we might have to suspend some disbelief, and how easily not only does it teach itself how to speak, but it also teaches itself how to read. Some of the great pieces of literature in the world that it happens to find in a satchel thrown in the woods. That said, there is a plot device as to how this is happening. As the creature is eavesdropping on the DeLacy family, the DeLacy's have admitted in a character named Safie, an outsider who is learning English. So supposedly the creature learns its English lessons while it's eavesdropping. If you've ever learned a foreign language, I suspect it's been a little bit more difficult than just eavesdropping. But nevertheless, we see how the creature also uses reason as the creature tries to reason with Victor about why the creature should be given a mate. And ultimately, the creature compares itself both to Adam from the Adam and Eve myth, created by a god, and then ultimately having to experience pain and despair. And also it compares itself to Satan, because Satan was also created by God as the most beautiful angel in heaven. And then ultimately this angel was rejected for humanity, and this angel helped to tempt humanity. And these are stories that you can find not only in the Bible, but in John Milton's Paradise Lost, which happens to be a very famous piece of epic poetry, which is one of the ways that Mary Shelley began her book, by giving us a quote from Paradise Lost, so we can see just how erudite Mary Shelley happens to be as well. So the creature gives us a story about the DeLacy family, which happens to be about an exile family, a group of Europeans that had wealth and privilege, but basically lost all of that through some political upheaval. and they are headed by a blind old man. And the blindness is important because this man can't see. So in other words, he can't be horrified by the creature's physical appearance. Therefore, the creature has an opportunity to establish a relationship with this blind man. But as you know, if you have finished reading the novel, the family walks in while the creature and the blind man are speaking. Family is horrified and attacks the creature, and basically the creature runs off. And in the movie, we saw how the creature tries to befriend the little girl and doesn't really understand that she is different from a petal of a flower and can't just be thrown into the water. It's a very different kind of episode in the novel where the creature encounters a drowning girl, and despite the pain and the isolation the creature has experienced, rather than ignore the drowning girl, he tries to save her. And the result is that the creature is once again attacked. So we see that the creature's first impulses tend to be good and benevolent, and it's only after experience with the cruelty of humanity that it begins to learn how to be cruel itself, which is one of the messages of the novel. In fact, in chapter 13, the creature says, "Was man indeed at once so powerful, so virtuous and magnificent, yet so vicious and base?" Perhaps that's a question we can ask ourselves in 2020 as well. Well, we learn about this woman who's learning language, this outsider who's come to visit the DeLacy family. Her name is Saifi. She's a Christian Arab. And basically, Saifi was taught to aspire to the higher powers of intellect and independence of spirit, forbidden to the female followers of Muhammad by her mother, who was a Christian Arab. Saifi's father, however, as we also learn in chapter 14, had a good amount of disdain for the idea that his daughter should be united to a Christian, in other words, to Felix. So there's this convoluted story about how Felix and the DeLacy family helped Saifi's father, and he's given his daughter as a prize, which again says a great amount about how female would be viewed at the time. Luckily, the daughter and Felix, Saifi and Felix, are in love, but this is all a ruse by the father. He's only pretending to give him Saifi, and that ultimately he's disgusted by the idea that Saifi could end up with a European. And he tries to deny that relationship. And basically, Saifi's response is to run away from home and to find Felix, which shows an incredible amount of bravery and strength and agency for female, especially during this time period. She doesn't know the language, and yet she's able to take a stand in a way that Justine, who confessed to a crime that she never committed, could never take a stand about. And even something like Elizabeth, in some ways, she's quite passive as she continues to wait and wait and wait for Victor. And at one point, even suggesting, perhaps you're in love with another and your happiness is paramount to me. So if you are in love with another, we can stop our engagement right here. At any rate, in chapter 15, we learn about how the creature finds out about its history, or how it found out about its history, when it says that soon after my arrival in this hovel, I discovered some papers in the pocket of the dress which I had taken from your Victor's laboratory. So the creature learns its story through letters. That seems appropriate because we're learning this story through letters as well. So it's an epistolary novel embedded within epistolary novels. And the creature says, "On you," and this is in chapter 16, "on you only had I any claim for pity and redress." In other words, Victor has a responsibility as the creator, the father figure, in effect. And the creature's request is that Victor create a female for it, much like an Adam and Eve situation, so that ultimately they could be a couple and not be isolated, but yet they wouldn't be other, at least in the sense to each other. And when I say other, I talk about the idea of difference, so that they could perhaps continue their lives, albeit they would be rejected by society. They would at least have one another. And the creature makes some wonderful arguments. I think it's quite telling that the creature wants a creature created simply for its own benefit. Think about how Victor created a creature simply for its own benefit. That said, it's easy to empathize with the creature and not wanting to be alone and isolated. Creature never has to be created. And what's even worse is that once it's created, Victor never takes any responsibility for the creature. So Victor's guilty of two sins here. First is the actual creation, which violates the laws of nature. And secondly, and perhaps more importantly, is negating any responsibility at all that he has for his creation. So it makes sense that the creature is asking for a mate, and yet also the idea of the creature asking for a female in order to give him a certain level of happiness. I think it is also, or could be also seen as a kind of commentary about the role of female in society. And that'll be today's attendance question, because I'm curious to hear, do you think that Victor should have created a female for the creature? Why or why not? Um, and what might the female have experienced when she was created, which is what Victor uses as a rationale or perhaps excuse, depending on your perspective, on why Victor decides that he doesn't want to create a female, that this female might reject the creature, or that the female and the creature might end up having children of their own. Though I suspect if Victor has enough science to create life from death, he could probably create a sterile female. But that's just an aside. And he also comes up with reasonings that he's already made one mistake and he doesn't want to increase the number of mistakes that he makes over the course of the novel by repeating that. So Victor's decision ultimately is to not create this female, and that's the proverbial last straw for the creature, and that it's decided that at that point it will have revenge on Victor, and there is no chance for redress. In chapter 19, Victor says, I felt as if I had committed some great crime, but I was guiltless, although I had indeed drawn down a horrible curse upon my head. And I think this is another example of Victor sort of talking about the idea that I'm guilty, but not really guilty. The vacillation that occurs throughout the novel. And the creature says, I shall be with you on your wedding night. Victor interprets that the creature is going to be attacking Victor, because Victor is very self-centered and he's convinced everything is about him. Of course, the greatest way to get revenge on someone or to hurt somebody is not to hurt them, but to hurt the people they love. And we see that the creatures learned this lesson very well through its readings and its understandings of humanity. It initially does that with William, and then it continues on now at this point with not only killing Elizabeth, but killing Clerval. And Clerval and Victor have a very intimate relationship, a very close friendship. In some ways, you might say that it could hurt Victor more that Clerval is killed rather than Elizabeth, even though Elizabeth is Victor's fiancée. And I can say that there have been some scholars that have talked a little bit about that relationship between Victor and Clerval. Could there be some sort of homoerotic tendency there? Regardless, what matters most is that the people that Victor cares for have been eliminated by this creature. And then in chapter 24, finally, we return back to Walton. It's very easy to forget that we started this novel with Walton. All of this has been basically Walton writing in a letter to his sister what he has heard from Victor. And part of what he has heard from Victor is what Victor says he has heard from the creature. So again, we've got a complicated narrative. And Walton's crew is ready to mutiny because things are so bad where they are, and in terms of trying to discover undiscovered lands. And Victor in chapter 24 says to this mutinous or almost mutinous crew, be men, or be more than men. Be steady to your purposes and firm as a rock. Which always strikes me, because Victor at the beginning was saying, don't follow my madness. In other words, don't pursue that which you are not meant to pursue. And yet at this point, at the very ending, right before Victor's death, he's basically telling Walton's crew to continue on despite the dangers. So again, I think that says something about Victor's character and his lack of real understanding. We also are introduced to the creature. There's been this adventure scene, this chase scene going on in the ice where Victor and the creature, or Victor is chasing the creature and the creature's leaving clues. Basically, this kind of father-son relationship, hate and love, where they need one another to exist. And the creature says that it was impotent envy and bitter indignation that filled him with an insatiable thirst for vengeance. that he was the slave, not the master, of an impulse which he detested, yet could not disobey. And then finally, at the very ending of the novel, the creature, now that Victor has died, is, I shall collect my funeral pile and consume to ashes this miserable frame. In other words, the creature is going to commit suicide. Notice we don't see the creature commit suicide. That always leaves the possibility for a sequel there. The creature could change its mind, but at least the way we're supposed to interpret this is that now that Victor is no longer alive, there isn't any reason for the creature to be alive. The only reason why the creature existed at this point was for vengeance, and vengeance has been achieved. And it strikes me that he's going to kill himself with fire. So much of this novel takes place in ice. After all, Walton is discovering or trying to discover the Arctic. And those extremes of fire and ice, I think work very nicely in terms of some of the thematic ways that we see the extremes in this particular novel. So that, I hope, gives you a bit of an overview of Frankenstein and some of the major points. Not that I've talked about it in its entirety, hardly not. That said, you will have the opportunity to write about Frankenstein briefly in about a page or so, if you haven't already done so, for your journal. And you can hand that in up until the 11th, though the sooner the better for everybody involved. We are moving forward to talk about Persuasion, which is a very different kind of text, which I will talk about next class, as well as introduce the idea of writing papers so that we can prepare for our first formal writing assignment. So again, our attendance question, as you can see in the notes above, is, do you think Victor should have created a female for the creature? Why or why not? So I'm curious to hear what you have to say. I hope you're well. I'm well. And I'll see you on Thursday. Take care. I will sort of see you on Thursday. Bye-bye.